pieces. As the city grew, they would add the wall on out and move the wall on out. Now, the last statement that I have there, since the location of the city exchanged and the walls were added to over hundreds of years, there are some of the original structures that were included in the city of David and in the Solomon era that are outside of the walls today. They're not inside the actual walls that exist today. Now, that is an approximate, due to archaeological digs. Well, I tell you what, I'm having a problem with this today. This is the city of David from here down. And those are the buildings that have been just the outlines of the building. Now, there's no pictures or anything of what the buildings exactly encompass, but they have an idea due to the architecture of the era what those buildings would have looked like, okay? And so that's where the city of David ended. This right here represents David's palace. Now, David's palace was in the city of David, and it's only been uncovered and actually identified just in the past 20 years. And they know exactly where his palace inside the original city was. Now, the name. The first recorded name, Usalem. That was the Canaanite name given to that area, what we think of as the city of David. It is found in Egyptian writings when they referred to this area. The city of Salem was a Canaanite deity, and that's where they come up with that name. The city of Jebus, when the Jebusites owned the city, after the Canaanites came the Jebusites who defeated them and took over the city, and they changed the name to Jebus. The city of David, Jerusalem, that translates today in English as Jerusalem. The Israelite, oddly enough, the Israelite government today and for the past many years have said we should go back to the original name of the city, and they actually promote that. So what we commonly refer to as Jerusalem, and of course our Bibles, which were translated many, many years later, have translated the English alliteration of Jerusalem, and so there's a natural hesitation for the government to be able to change the name back to its original name. Now this is, if I can get this stuff all, I've turned too many pages here, and it's, so when you talk about Jerusalem, you talk about the first temple period, which is Solomon, and then there's a second temple period from 586 to 70. Now, it's based upon the temple itself. So after the destruction, all the way up to AD 70, when Rome destroyed the temple again, you have these intermediate periods where the Persians were in control, then the Greeks were in control, and then the Romans were in control of the city. Herod the Great in 37 enlarged the Temple Mount. Now, remember I told you that what Solomon built, it had a wall there, and I said, there's another wall. He doubled the size of the temple area. He went from 7 acres to about 14 acres when Herod in 37 enlarged and rebuilt the temple. He completely tore down the walls and everything. And the temple was completely dismantled, and he built the temple again and expanded the size of the Temple Mount by 7 acres. Now, the last statement there, the remains of the Second Temple period that remains today, we're talking about after Roman tore the temple down. The only thing that's left is the Kidron Valley tombs, the Wailing Wall, what you commonly see on the western wall, that is still there. Robertson's Arch, Herodians, and archaeological tombs. I tried to, when on the south side of Jerusalem, the Kidron Valley, on the other side on the walls, you find these tombs. And these are carved right straight out of the rock, and those tombs are still there, and they were built back during Nehemiah's time in that interim period. Just to give you an idea, down here, here's the tomb of Caiaphas. We know Caiaphas as the high priest during the time of Jesus. His tomb is right there. I think, let me see if I can find it here so I don't. Annas is right here. Remember, Annas was the high priest and deposed by Roman, and they put in Caiaphas for the high priest. So during all the stories of Jesus and everything, you get both of those guys being talked about. Him as the Annas as the high priest, and Caiaphas as the high priest. Okay, so now that's kind of a review. Nehemiah receives news from his brother Hanani upon his return from Judah to Susa. Nehemiah lives in Susa. Remember, that's one of the capital cities of the Persian Empire. He lives there. His brother Hanani went with Zerubbabel back to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple and those kinds of things. He comes back and he is asked by his brother Nehemiah, how's everybody doing? Basically, that's what he's trying to find out. How are the exiles that have returned, how are they progressing? Remember that the walls of the city had been pulled down and the gates had been buried by Nebuchadnezzar. Now this is something I want you to get, let's think of time. From the time that Nebuchadnezzar destroyed Jerusalem and Nehemiah goes back to rebuild the walls, it's been 144 years. Kind of put that in perspective. We normally think because Nehemiah starts the next chapter after the last chapter of Ezra. We say, okay, so Ezra, it's hard to get the time spans. It's been 144 years. There's only 70 years in captivity. But by the time Nehemiah goes back to actually start rebuilding the walls, it's been 144 years. So there's been no walls around Jerusalem. And some people think that's one of the reasons why Artaxerxes said, well, a city without walls is not even a city. Being a conqueror himself, he would say, that's no city at all unless it has walls around it for protection. So maybe that has something to do with the idea of him giving permission to Nehemiah to go back. When Nehemiah hears about this, he does the same thing Ezra did when it was brought to his idea that the people went right back to the same way they've always been, doing everything that God told him not to do. He just sat down and wept. And he confesses to God the sins that we Israelites, including myself and my father's family, have committed against you. We have acted wickedly and not obeyed the commands, decrees, and laws you gave your servant to Moses. He prays for God's holy city. And that's the same type of confession and the same reaction they get, these religious holy people actually get when they find out how the people are doing the same thing again. In chapter 2 of Nehemiah, Nehemiah reveals why he is sad to King Artaxerxes. The king asks, well, what is it that you want me to do about it? Remember, there's been several kings since Nebuchadnezzar. There's been a pretty good time gap in here, okay? And so Artaxerxes just says, well, what do you want me to do about it? Nehemiah asks if he's allowed to return to rebuild the city. Now, he doesn't say rebuild the walls, and if you read Nehemiah closely, he says rebuild the city. Because like I said, Artaxerxes knows a city is not a city unless it has walls around it. It's just houses. Artaxerxes sends letters to all the governors in the Trans-Euphrates so that they will provide safe conduct to Nehemiah. He was also given letters that other governors would provide materials to rebuild the gates of Jerusalem. And it says, and because the hand of my God was on me, the king gave me everything that I asked for. This is Nehemiah's response. He said, because it was recognized that God's hand was on my heart to do this job, and so God granted everything that I asked. Problem. That's the easy part, right? He's still in Susa. Now, verse 10, when Sanballat the Hornite and Tobiah the Ammonite officials heard this, that they were very much disturbed that someone had come to promote the welfare of the Israelites. These are governors that are in surrounding territory. Now, they have been appointed as governors by the various kings, so they have control on what goes on. I told you earlier that there are some of the walls. This is a picture of Jerusalem at the completion of the walls. That's what it looks like. So when Nehemiah completes his walls around the city of David, or Jerusalem, looks like this. Outside those walls, these two walls here, this wall and this wall here, those were Solomon's walls. So when Nehemiah rebuilt the walls, he moved in a little bit because of where the rubble was and how easy it was for him to move the stone. This here, in Solomon's day, this is a large water basin, and it was fed by underground streams. Now, eventually, there will be a tunnel that leads from here underground, carved through stone, and ends up inside the gate, inside the walls. And anybody who's done that journey to Israel and been in Jerusalem, they try to get you to take that walk underground. It's about 5.5 foot tall and I'd say about this wide. Everybody that goes gets their flashlights or their phones out and turns the lights on, and you go down in water about this deep, and you walk about 1/4 of a mile until you come out the other end. And so that runs from that fresh water supply so that the people will always have water during battle. A surrounding group can't keep them from getting water. Now, up until this time, it's very clear in Nehemiah, he does not tell the people why he's come. And so it's nighttime, and he says, by night I went out through the valley gate, which is on, if you're looking at Jerusalem and it's up here, the valley gate is on the left-hand wall, and at the very tip of that, it's called the Dung Gate, D-U-N-G, and everybody here knows what that's for. That's where all the horses and everything like that and the manure was all taken outside the city through that particular gate. So he went out. Let's see here. Okay. The valley gate is right up here. The dung gate is right down here. He comes out here, starts to ride his horse around here, gets to be about right to the fountain gate, and there's so much rubble there, and the old wall that's been pulled down by Nebuchadnezzar that was just left lay, he can't go any further. So he goes down, he drops off here, and this is the Valley of Kindred. He goes down and he starts to ride up here, and there's so much rubble down in there and everything. He just stops and turns around and comes back and goes all the way back up and goes back in the valley gate. He just gives up. That's his nighttime. He wants to see what it actually looks like. But he doesn't want anybody to know why he's there. So he examines what's left, all the stones that have been torn down and just left in big piles alongside. When Sanballat the Hornite, Tobiah, and Geshem said, "Are you rebelling against the king?" They see this work start. He's convinced the people they need to rebuild the walls. And so they start organizing themselves and start clearing the rubble out of the way so they can start rebuilding the walls. They're using all of the stones that were in the previous wall. They're not going out and manufacturing new stones. And I'll show you why in just a couple minutes. Yeah, we got time. So when they heard, they said, "What are you doing? Are you rebelling against the king?" They're talking about Artaxerxes. He's back in Susa, the Persian king at the time. So that's, they don't like this. The answer, Nehemiah says, "The God of heaven will give us success. We, his servants, will start rebuilding. But as for you, you have no share in Jerusalem or any claim or historic right to it." Same answer that Zerubbabel gave the Samaritans when they came down and asked him if they could help rebuild the altar and the temple. He says, "Go back home. You have no part in this. This is between God and his chosen people, Israel." Okay? Didn't make a lot of friends there with that answer, but that's... Okay, here's the ruling areas. Here's Sanballat, Tobiah the Ammonite, and Geshem the Arab. These are the areas which they were governor over. So the Persian said, "You're the governor of this area up here, you're the governor of this one, and your job is to keep peace, keep things organized, collect my taxes, and send my taxes to me. And I also may ask you to send troops. If I have to go somewhere and fight off somebody, I'll ask you for a contribution of so many foot soldiers and so many chariots and so many horses to go with. And if you do, you keep your governorship." Now, we're not going to go through all the families. I know some of you are familiar with that in chapter 3, all the different families are listed that go into rebuilding the wall. Now, each family takes a portion of the wall, and it's their job to go from here to here, maybe from this gate to your job. Your family is supposed to rebuild the gate. You go from here to here. Next family goes from here. And so the families were divided up. I know you can't see this, but it gives you an idea. This is the top, the temple. Here's the bottom. Now, there's a place in here that's called the broad wall, B-R-O-A-D, broad, like really wide. And there was a special group that was for defense, and I'll show you that in a little bit. Now, many parts and pieces of this wall have been found. Nehemiah's wall. Now remember that Nehemiah's wall is going to suffer under the Romans. So Nehemiah's wall stays intact, but it's added to, it's improved, some other pieces are torn down and new pieces put in, but Nehemiah's wall basically stays intact. Opposition, verbal attacks by Sanballat and his and one of their remarks was even a fox that would walk on top of the wall would break it down. They were doing anything they could to discourage these people who were rebuilding a wall, a defensive wall around their city. Okay? Nehemiah prays for their insults to be turned on them. In verse 7 through 10, when the repairs were progressing, the opponents plotted to attack them while they were working. And they had to stop and go through a defensive mechanism to protect the families who were rebuilding the wall from people that were coming down from Sanballat and Tobias to actually kill the workers, to stop them from building the wall. Nehemiah posted guards to protect the workers. The workers continued to have half built on the wall and half to stand guard, and a trumpet would signal any kind of an attack on a different part, and other people would rush there for defense. The work on the wall was nonstop, with the workers staying inside Jerusalem at nighttime. So the wall would stop building at night, they'd go inside. All right. I hope you can see these. This gives you an example of wall building 101 during this one in Solomon's time. You can see the wall here. These are typical walls. These are inside walls. These walls here are all inside this structure here. All of this picture here, and up to here, this is existing wall. These are walls along the Kidron Valley. So you have the valley down here, and these are all walls left over from Solomon's time, the original walls. And you can see quite clearly how they were built. Same way Europeans, when they would inherit a field and they wanted to turn it in, you went in and carried all the rocks out to the edge, and you built a wall out of the rocks that you took out of your farmland. That's the same thing they did in building walls in those days. Now, that doesn't match the picture you might have in your mind from seeing pictures today when the walls were more professionally built. But in those days, that's the way they were built. Now, you might build like the temple, you might quarry some stone, a nice smooth stone for the temple, because it was very important. Okay. This is one large section along the Kidron Valley of some of the original Nehemiah walls. Now remember, all of these stones that he used to rebuild were at the bottom of that wall. when they were torn down. And so the workers would get them and hoist them up or carry them up, and some people would be building walls and putting dirt. They did not use cement then. They did have some material which they used as filling in between, but these are the famous Nehemiah step structures. From the very edge of the Kidron Valley that falls off, from right there was a sloping dirt panel, and they just used stepping stones, like right here. They just went up, and each row went a few inches in, next one a few inches in, and they rebuilt the walls. Now, this girl is to give you some idea of size. She was one of the archaeology crews that worked on this. Now, here's one of the important parts. Right where she's standing is about 10 feet from the corner of David's palace. David's palace was built right along the edge of the Kidron Valley, and so right back in here is the beginning, and those are the stones. These stones here are the ones that were part of the stones that have been excavated in David's palace inside. So that tells you where we're at, doesn't it? We're still in the city of David. The temple is back to the right. So we're right at the very end of the city of David. That is the broad wall. That is a defensive wall by the temple. And if someone's attacking, they could move soldiers 213 feet in chariots. They could run on top of that broad wall. It was wide enough so you could have horses and chariots actually transposed for around 200 feet. So they could move people. Now, you can see how deep that is in the ground. So you've got buildings torn down, buildings torn down, buildings torn down, and eventually you get back to the broad wall that was built by Nehemiah for defense. Now, it also tells you something else. You have outer walls, and then you got inner fill. So they build a wall, and then they would fill it, and then they would build some more, and then they would fill it, and build it some more, and fill it. That's how they built large walls. Now, Tom is not here, but he pointed something out to me. Tom Cloninger has been there, and Tom told me one time when I showed him this picture, and he said, you know, we stood right up here, right by David's palace, which is right back in here. And he said, you stop and think of the story of David and Bathsheba. And how does David meet Bathsheba the first time? You remember the story? He's out on his veranda, on his patio, and he kind of looks down over, and there's a house down there, and here's this beautiful woman, Bathsheba, probably washing or whatever, taking her by her idea of a sponge bath, or that's what they used to call those, sponge. Well, you can see how that could take place, can't you? Where he could look down off his outside of his palace and see that. This, by the way, is one thing. It's a 586 house that was built at the base of the wall. So outside the wall on the Kidron Valley, someone had built a house. Just a few rows of stone out and put a roof on it, and you have a house. By their standards, that was a house. This up here shows Nehemiah built on top of the original Solomon walls Solomon's walls were right here. Nehemiah's people built this, restored the stones in here, and the wall is repaired. So when it says that he rebuilt, you didn't rebuild from the ground up every time. Some of the walls had to be rebuilt almost all the way up. Temple stones, Western Wall stones. This is another picture of Solomon's quarry. Solomon's quarry is underneath Jerusalem, very deep underneath, and those stones were carved from underneath. Well, I'm trying to think how. I want you to get an idea of the scope. The corner walls that Herod put together at the end, some of them weigh as much as 50 tons. Those are good math. We got 100,000-pound stones on the corners to start the wall when he rebuilds. And the question has always been whether it's an Egyptian temple or Egyptian pyramid or something like. What did they have to lift those stones up that high? If you try to pick them up, what ropes are going to do that? What kind of wood device are you going to? Why don't we think of it this way? Those heavy stones were not lifted up and placed on top of each other. The dirt around the wall, on the inside of the wall, they hauled in dirt. They had over 20,000 people working on this project when Herod rebuilt the thing. He enlarged that wall by 7 acres, that area. They bring dirt in and build the dirt up inside, build it a little bit higher than the last layer. And so what they do is they roll in on logs, very large stone with oxen, take them up to the top. They have some type of lowering device. They attach the stone and they lower the stone into the previous layer. They bring in more dirt, and each time they go up, they bring in more dirt, and when the project is done, they dig all the dirt out and take it out. That is the best example of how they handle those very large, heavy stones. Okay? This is an interesting one. We talk about Nehemiah, the person who was able to organize the people to build the wall. The effects of drought and taxes and poverty on those in Judea at the time were tremendous. Many of the area rulers like Tobiah, Sanballat, and those people had become wealthy off the poor. The poor had mortgaged their fields to get money for grain. The Persian taxes were excessive. Some citizens had to sell their children. I've had people go, oh, they did what? And I think I probably reacted the same way when I went to northern Ghana and found out that villages, when the parents had died, the grandparents could not afford to feed their kids, and so they took and they sold them to the fishing villages. They're called bond servants. And the bond servant is to serve however many years that the agreement is. That was going on in 2010, 2015 in Ghana. So the idea of selling your children to get money to buy grain so you can, the rest of your family can stay alive was, we may not like it and it's distasteful, but it was a fact of life. There is a Jewish historian, and I'm going to read his statement. However, the debt was supposed to end after 7 years, the year of Jubilee, right? We all know that. But one Jewish historian remarked that the year of Jubilee had never been held. There is no record of the year of Jubilee being held in the Scriptures. Now, if you find one, please let me know, because I've looked several times. That's when all debt has to be forgiven and their lands returned. So you could borrow money from your Jewish neighbor, and at the end of the 7 years, he had to give your land back to you. Mistreatment. Now, the men and women raised their great outcry against their fellow Jews. This isn't Persians, these are Jewish people against Jewish people. We and our sons and daughters are numerous. In order for us to eat and stay alive, we must get grain. Others were saying we've mortgaged our field, our vineyard, and our homes to get grain to eat. Others, we have had to borrow money to pay the king's taxes on our field and vineyards. We had to bond slave our children in order to live. Some of our daughters have already been enslaved, but we are powerless because our fields and vineyards belong to others. Nehemiah, these are regular people come in and complain to him. He deals with the issues immediately. Stop charging interest. Return their mortgaged lands and return the interest that you collected. The priest had to vow to see that it was done. Nehemiah stops the practice of eating at the table of governors, thus causing high taxes on the public. He was always very conscious of the impact. They were huge. In the people who were in control would have everybody come in and eat at their table. Well, they charged taxes from the people to pay for these grand meals, and that was every day that took place. Walls are completed. Sanballat and them are not going to allow that to stand. They first said, listen, you've done such a great job. Why don't you come out and meet us over here? We'd like to talk to you about how we can help you. Well, Nehemiah is not dumb. He knows what they've got planned. They're going to assassinate him. He says, I'm not going. Second plot, he flee into the temple and protect yourself. Your enemies outside are going to come in. Why don't you go hide in the temple? Well, if he goes into the temple, he's not allowed to go in the temple. He's not a priest, nor is he a Levite. He's not allowed to go in there. He says, no, I'm not going in there and hide. There's also well, that's close enough. Okay, this is, remember now, most of the homes and houses that were in the city of David that people lived in at the time of the destruction had not been rebuilt. So the next thing is rebuild the city. And so he appoints people to stand guard at all the gates. He closes all the gates in the evening. He finds the registry who owns the land. Remember when Zerubbabel left to come back, he required everybody to give him a copy of their registry to prove who they were and what their families lived and whose land belonged to them. The whole country that had came back was 42,000 people. Each group settled in their own town. So he moved everybody out of Jerusalem so that they could clear everything and rebuild the houses. Those people who had lived there originally and could prove that, the priests up on the hill and different places, they could stay, and then he would repopulate the city as they built it. lot of stuff. Nehemiah was a great leader. He was able to get a tremendous amount done. There was a tremendous amount that needed to be done. Now, what you're going to see is that that's the part of rebuilding the walls. You're going to have to understand now that people are still people, aren't they? And because they were getting things accomplished does not mean that they were getting that much accomplished religiously. Restoring the law, restoring the people following the law. Every time the people go off, the same problems keep cropping back up because people are people. And so they've accomplished a certain part of the reestablishment and of the city. But they have not accomplished what Ezra was sent there to do. Ezra was sent there to reestablish the religion and to get the people to obey the religion. He still has work to do. And next week we're going to talk about that particular Ezra, okay? They will reestablish an agreement between themselves and God. They would do a new covenant. And so the next few chapters talk about the covenant that they bring back into effect in Nehemiah. Thank you.